Hello everyone, Jay Warden here, and after 26 episodes of recaps and reviews, it's time to take a look at Season 1 as a whole, its few ups, its many downs, how our characters have fared, and maybe some fun bits of trivia along the way. The first season of any show can be a very hit and miss affair as it tries to establish the settings, its style, the characters, and stories it wants to tell. And most shows will rise and continue or fall and be cancelled based on that first impression. For TNG, aside from starting out okay in the pilot encounter at Farpoint, it rapidly went downhill from there, batting out several stinkers in the first half of the season alone, such as The Naked Now, Code of Honor, Lonely Among Us, Justice, and Angel 1, with the rest being average or middling at best, with only the battle standing out as a coherent, interesting story in the first half of the season. The second half of the season did start to turn things around a little with far fewer stinkers and some actual decent episodes, but not nearly enough to redeem the season as a whole, and a far cry from what's still to come. So really it's downright shocking how TNG avoided cancellation, because the bulk of the season is pretty bad for a TV show, and probably the worst first season of any Star Trek show to date as we start the year 2020. Yet, survive it did, simply because Paramount ended up making a healthy profit from it, thanks to its strategy of first-run syndications and advertising selling to the TV stations that wanted to broadcast the show. Although many of the episodes have good or interesting concepts, nearly always the show failed to implement them or simply glossed over the concepts in favour of something else entirely, and falling flat on its face as a result. Too many episodes have meandering, messy scripts with dumb plot points, or relying on our characters being too stupid to figure out something blatantly obvious. I think another big problem is the show doesn't really know what it wants to be yet, and fails to establish its own distinct identity, instead frequently relying on recycled TOS scripts, tropes, or episode themes, coupled with haphazard attempts to give our characters growth beyond their baseline archetypes. Overall, it makes the season pretty hard to watch at times, and you could easily skip a massive chunk of it to move on to the second season. Yet it still does some work in laying the foundations of what would become one of the most beloved Trek shows, so it's important to see where this all came from. So just why was this season so bad? What caused this horrific mess, and how did the show that started off with episodes like this...
I challenge your right of supersedence!
No woman has challenged supersedence for over 200 years.
Shall we go there now, or remain and play?
Play?
I'd love.
Mr. Data will need access to your library.
Our library is far too sophisticated for a man to comprehend.
end up becoming a great show with episodes like this.
I am Locutus of Borg. Resistance is futile.
The first duty of every Starfleet officer is to the truth, whether it's scientific truth, or historical truth, or personal truth.
There are 4 lives!
Well, let's take a look behind the scenes and delve into the history of the creation of TNG. As far back as 1972, Paramount Pictures were already considering creating a new Star Trek thanks to TOS's success in syndication by doing a film based on the series. But when Star Wars came along in 1977, they decided to focus on developing a new TV series instead, with TOS actors set to reprise their roles. This TV show would be the flagship of a new 4th TV network in the US, and a 13-episode series was ordered. Sets were built, scripts written, and props were made. But as time went on, Paramount realised this 4th network would be unable to turn a profit, and having already spent $500,000 on production, about $2 million in today's money, Paramount wanted to recoup its expenses somehow, so once again switched back to doing a film. And so Star Trek The Motion Picture was created from a revised script of the intended pilot of the new series, which was called Phase 2, and all the work created so far was repurposed for the film, which was eventually released in 1979, to mixed reviews at best. The only thing put to film from Phase 2 were a few minutes of test footage which showed 2 of the 3 new characters that were to be part of the series. A Vulcan called Zon, meant to replace Spock after Nimoy refused to sign on, and a Deltan called Ilea. A third new character, Will Decker, was meant as a way to eventually replace William Shatner should he become too expensive to keep on if Phase 2 was a success. Decker and Ilia would still show up in the motion picture, but as Nimoy finally agreed to reprise his role, the character of Zon was canned entirely. However, the basic ideas of these three characters were not forgotten, and eventually Decker, Ilia, and Zon became the basis of creation for the characters of Riker, Troi, and Data respectively. So, 7 years and 4 films later, Paramount once again came back to the idea of a TV show, and in 1986 they commissioned a new series, this time set far in the future of TOS with a brand new crew of unknown actors, because this would be much cheaper than paying the much higher salaries of the TOS actors, and this is what would become the Next Generation. Gene Roddenberry had initially declined to be involved with the series, but being unhappy with how initial development of TNG was turning out, he agreed to come on board, but only if he had creative control of the series. Fearing fan backlash if he wasn't fully involved, Paramount accepted his demands, and so Roddenberry took the reins, and it's here some real problems started to develop. After bringing on board many of those who were instrumental in helping him with TOS back in the 60s, including the late DC Fontana, he redesigned the series Bible and in particular noted that by this point in time, humans had completely evolved beyond their baser needs and were completely devoid of interpersonal conflict with each other. Probably one of the worst constraints you could have on a writer when you're trying to create drama or conflict between your characters. Roddenberry was so insistently dogmatic on the adherence to his Bible that writers described it as very constricting, ridiculous, and many were unable to deal with Roddenberry's ego and treatment of them, often going on angry rants during meetings towards the writers at what they came up with. He apparently almost completely rewrote the first 15 episodes because of how unhappy he was with the scripts, which may begin to finally help us explain why the first half of Season 1 was such a dud with so many awful episodes. It was around this time though that amongst all of this, Roddenberry's health started to decline significantly, having mini strokes with his energy levels going all over the place, and probably contributed to his various moods, and leaving the show without a captain to run the ship, so to speak. To try and protect him, in comes his longtime friend and personal lawyer, Leonard Maislish, to make sure his vision was strictly adhered to and to argue his case to Paramount when needed. This, however, simply made things worse for everyone. Despite not being officially on the crew or part of the Writers Guild, Maislish would often sit in on meetings, ghostwriting memos, contributing to scripts, even going as far as to sneak into writers' offices at night to rewrite whole sections of their scripts to fit with Roddenberry's vision, even after being banned from the studio lot after a grievance was filed against him by the Writers Guild. Maislish would end up being utterly despised by everyone, and as a result of this, TNG had a very high attrition rate of writers, many unable to deal with the stress they were under, angry at having been treated in such disrespectful ways, and resentful of the constraints they were put under, while other writers were simply outright fired. In the end, Season 1 had a turnover of some 30 writers and staff members. One notable example was a writer who was a big fan of Star Trek. He came in, was warmly welcomed to the team by Roddenberry, wrote an episode, and then the very next day was fired by Roddenberry. As a result of Roddenberry's deteriorating health and the lack of direction, Paramount hired a new head writer or showrunner, Maurice Hurley, someone who had never worked in sci-fi before, having only previously done cop shows, such as Miami Vice. This in turn brought its own problems as he clashed with Roddenberry, who didn't like what Hurley was writing, and he often ended up in conflict with the other writers, causing even more resentment. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, it was topped off towards the end of the season by the beginning of the Writers Guild strike of 1988, which lasted for over 5 months and greatly affected production of Season 2 as well, which ended up with 22 episodes instead of the usual 26. It's no wonder then that once you realise what was going on behind the scenes, why many of the first season's episodes are such a convoluted mess of ideas and concepts that are poorly implemented, or plots that just meander about all over the place. Common criticisms of Season 1 are unoriginal plots, often borrowing directly from TOS, clumsy real-world allegories, stilted dialogue, and forced characterizations. And yet despite all of this, the show was ultimately a great success for Paramount, making huge profits off advertisements and syndication rights, with the first season becoming the highest rated syndicated series by the end of the season. The show received 7 nominations at the Emmys in 1988, winning 3 of them, all in the creative side of things for makeup, costume design, and sound editing. Eventually, Paramount realised they needed to start sidelining Roddenberry or the show might end up collapsing, and so slowly but surely, and in part due to Roddenberry's ailing health, he was pushed further and further aside, with Rick Berman slowly taking up the reins, eventually completely succeeding Roddenberry as the executive producer in Season 3, doing his best, for better or worse, to uphold the vision that Roddenberry had for the future of Star Trek. This does mean that Season 2 has its own similar problems, but not quite to the same degree Season 1 had at least. In some ways I feel that Roddenberry has some similarities to George Lucas. Both were instrumental in creating 2 of the most famous sci-fi universes in history, both very distinct from each other, both rich in lore and world building, and each one with its own huge, dedicated and loyal fanbase, yours truly included. Yet both men were terrible when it came to actually writing decent stories and dialogue within those universes after their initial breakaway successes. Whatever you may think of Disney's current handling of the Star Wars franchise, George Lucas remains a divisive figure for his work on the prequels, for which he had total and complete control, and his ever ongoing edits of the original trilogy. Likewise, Roddenberry likely almost killed his own creation with his fervent insistence on keeping to the strict guidelines while he had total control over the process. One wonders how things might have turned out for Star Trek if he hadn't passed away in 1991. What I've just explained to you is a fairly brief overall picture to give you an idea of what happened, so if you really want to get down to the juicy details, then I highly recommend you watch the documentary Chaos on the Bridge, written, produced, directed and narrated by William Shatner, which is not quite as bad as it sounds. It contains interviews with many of the figures critical to the development of TNG, including then President of Paramount John Pike, Rick Berman, showrunner Maurice Hurley, writers DC Fontana and Ronald D. Moore, and others, and it's really a fascinating delve into the details of how the show came to be. If you're worried at all about Shatner trying to steal the limelight, don't. Unlike his Captains documentary, he keeps a fairly low profile and sticks to the material in question. So with all that said and done, let's move on and take a look at how our characters fared in this opening season. As the leading man who had to fill the very big shoes of one beloved Captain James T. Kirk, Patrick Stewart had his work cut out for him from the very start. For the show to really work, the crew has to revolve around its captain, and that captain sets the tone with their style and authority. Stewart is a fantastic actor, without a doubt the best that TNG has to offer amongst its main cast members, and yet he was certainly not Roddenberry's first choice as the new captain of the Enterprise, and fans weren't immediately enamoured by him either. I mean, he's bald, British, and not Kirk. Who wants to see that, right? After some insistence, encouragement, and after seeing Stewart's audition, Roddenberry was finally sold, and thus a new Starfleet legend was, eventually, born. Yet, I don't think we've reached that point just yet. Season 1 Picard often feels like a shouty, angry sort of chap, often seemingly more annoyed at the events going on around him, certainly in the first half of the season anyway. I think once we hit the big goodbye and we saw a more personable side of him, he started to loosen up a little. But as much as Picard is best remembered for his speechifying, there aren't really any memorable speeches that he gives in Season 1. I think also part of the reason Picard loosens up a little was behind the scenes, Stewart was taking the job very, very seriously, and wasn't happy when everyone else was goofing around or having fun between takes, and even yelled at Denise Crosby once when she tried to get him to loosen up, saying that they weren't here to have fun. But eventually Stewart did loosen up, and he credits his time on TNG as the sole reason for him becoming a far more relaxed and funny person, and I think that shows in his character and performance as time goes on. Still, I think he's got some way to go yet before he really becomes the Picard that we all truly admire. Just as important as the captain is the choice of first officer and the dynamic between those two characters. You don't just want to copy the trio dynamic of Kirk, Spock and McCoy, as that was the signature character shtick of TOS, and if you tried to copy that, well, it's just not likely to work. Spock and McCoy are, respectively, the logical and emotional advisors to Kirk, influencing how he deals with situations and makes his decisions, and it's often through this dynamic that many of TOS's moral quandaries and problems were examined. Riker is most certainly not Spock, and he's not McCoy either. Instead, Jonathan Frakes infuses Riker with a welcoming charm and very likeable personality, and I feel it's a great foil to Picard's generally closed, stern exterior. I think we get a very good defined outline of who Riker is, and that he's very driven in his duty to Starfleet and desire to be a captain himself one day, and Season 1 often made a point of this. And he's not afraid of having fun or making a joke of a situation even in front of Picard, but still maintains a distinct authoritative command style, using his personable nature in order to engender loyalty and respect out of the crew, and is also quite willing to stand up to Picard when needed, something established quite strongly in the very first episode. As a result, we end up with a distinctly different dynamic over Kirk and Spock, especially as in TNG Picard tends to stay on the ship while Riker goes on the away missions, and so Riker needs to have more authority to him, I think, in order to represent the captain properly and manage his team. Spock might have been the first officer back in TOS, but he was never driven to be a captain, instead being a scientist first and only took command as necessary, and not always proving very good at it either. Certainly not in his interpersonal management skills anyway. I feel Frakes actually manages to define Riker as a character much quicker than most of his other cast members do with their own, even Picard. If there's one thing I just can't get behind, it's his lack of beard. I'm so used to the beard, and spending a season without it has always just been a little strange to me. And there's that trope of growing the beard, which signifies when a show starts to improve significantly in quality, which is started here by Riker. Of course, given the popularity of Spock, everyone wanted a Spock-like character on the show, and you do need a character that is outside the normal human condition in order to examine that condition closely. But this time a Vulcan was ruled out, and instead an inspired choice of using an emotionless android was done instead. This prevents the character from simply being Spock 2.0 and presents a great storytelling vehicle of a being that really wants to be more human but often fails at his attempts to understand, yet still able to present a completely logical argument and unique point of view to others. However, for the first few episodes, Brent Spiner was emoting far too much with Data, and it even looks like they hadn't quite finalised his makeup job yet, looking a bit too human in Encounter at Farpoint. As the season progressed though, he started behaving more and more like the android we would come to know, and his breakout episode was Data Lore. Despite being a very problematic episode in terms of plot and crew stupidity, Spiner did a superb job here of giving us two distinct performances as both Data and Lore, and showing us the core differences between them, as well as giving us a lot of welcome background and lore, no pun intended, regarding how Data came to exist. We also got introduced to his interest in Sherlock Holmes, and the show quite early on starts to establish a solid friendship with Geordi. Overall, Spiner does a great job with Data as the show progresses, and making sure he's not just Spock 2.0. Geordi LaForge didn't really get a huge amount to do for much of the season except be the blind guy with vision superpowers thanks to his visor, as well as flying the ship. But we did get sprinklings of characterization here and there, particularly with regards to his engineering chops, and it establishes fairly early on, as I mentioned, his solid friendship with Data. LeVar Burton is a good actor who emotes well, and makes Geordi a very likeable sort of chap. If anything, I think it's a crying shame we pretty much never get to see his eyes, because the one time we do, thanks to Riker briefly restoring his normal vision in Hide and Q, we can see that Burton has very expressive eyes that could have been a great asset to him. Geordi's standout moment came in the Arsenal of Freedom as he takes command of the Enterprise, and that episode did a great job of throwing various challenges at the young helmsman, both on a tactical and personal level, and I really think it helped to establish his own style and authority as he goes on to become chief engineer in Season 2 onwards. An interesting side note of trivia here. Tim Russ auditioned and was screen tested as LaForge before the producers finally chose Burton instead. He of course would eventually go on to play Tuvok over in Voyager, as well as a couple of guest appearances as other characters here and there. Deanna Troi is a mixed bag of a character, primarily because her abilities are only as useful as the plot requires them to be. In one episode, she can actually be quite insightful and informative regarding someone's intentions, while other times can't seem to sense anything useful or specific at all, and in yet more circumstances is unwelcomely annoying with her attempts to help the crew with their feelings. Marina Sirtis is not the strongest actress, and she certainly started off very wooden and stiff, but eventually fell into her role, and perhaps a standout moment for her was her verbal sparring with Armus in the episode Skin of Evil, where I felt she, her psychological background and her powers were all used in a smart and appropriate way. She did get her own character episode in Haven, where we meet her mother, but sadly that episode did nothing to really inform us about her character or allow her to grow in some fashion, as she's largely at the mercy of the events surrounding her, rather than taking any agency for herself beyond some minor background on Betazoid society. Some interesting trivia here is that Sirtis actually auditioned for the role of Lieutenant Yar while Denise Crosby auditioned for Troi, but Roddenberry felt that both would be better if they swapped around. I have to be honest, Dr. Crusher was my least favourite character on TNG, and through my watching of Season 1 with analysis mode on, this thought hasn't changed. I've always felt Gates McFadden is weak as an actress when it comes to being angry or forceful in a situation, doing much better in quieter scenes where she's just talking, listening, or perhaps figuring something out. She's no McCoy, and the show often tries to force an idea that she and Picard have this will they won't they attraction going on, egregiously so in literally the second episode where she openly tries to get Picard to bone her, albeit under extenuating if dumb circumstances. I never liked this aspect that the season has tried to push here because it never felt earned or an organically driven romantic interest. There is interesting background between the two characters, given Picard is directly responsible for her husband's death, but it's never really explored, and that's a shame. I felt it would have been better to explore this past history between them first, maybe have her initially harbour some hidden resentment or anger over what happened, before they both come to terms with it, thus helping to develop and build a much stronger relationship between the two over time. Later seasons do handle this much better, but it's not really until season 7 that this is finally addressed. Besides this, Crusher doesn't get a huge amount to do, and she never gets a full character-focused episode, but unlike Yar, she does at least get a lot more general attention, even if most of the time it's medical related. The rest of the time is usually spent fussing over Wesley for one reason or another, which neatly brings me to Wesley Crusher. The genius boy wonder child. Wesley is an easy target for haters because of how insufferably annoying he can be and how he's always saving the ship because the adults are too dumb to figure things out. But would it surprise you to know that in all 26 episodes of Season 1, Wesley only saves the ship 4 times? He does it in The Naked Now by pushing the ship out of the way of an oncoming asteroid, he figures out what's causing Picard to go crazy in The Battle, fixes the holodeck in The Big Goodbye, and immediately figures out Law is pretending to be Data in Data Law. And of those episodes, I'd say only 2 of them are cases of him being insufferably annoying, The Naked Now and The Battle, especially The Battle because of how smug and casual he is about it. In The Big Goodbye, although it doesn't make much sense he's trying to fix the holodeck instead of LaForge or another engineer, it's done in a slow, methodical manner, and in Data Law, he's only doing what everyone else should have been doing in the first place because the writers decided to simply make everyone else look dumb. I've mentioned a few times in my reviews now the problems of Wesley's character stem from the writing and not the acting. Wil Wheaton, who was a young teenager at the time, did an admirable job for an actor his age, and I honestly think he gets treated unfairly because of it. It was never Wheaton's fault, only the writers and how they treated the character. I got more annoyed at the crew's treatment of Wesley more than I did at Wesley himself bar the 2 episodes above I mentioned, often disparagingly calling him the boy or just telling him to shut up. I do get what they were aiming for here, that everyone always underestimates Wesley because he's just a kid and not realizing just how smart he is, but it's just too often implemented poorly. My favourite episode with Wesley in it was Coming of Age because it treated his character well and actually had him fail at something as well as showing us his fears instead of being a Mary Sue type character. I feel like one day I might actually make a separate video simply looking at the character of Wesley as a whole, but I need to finish doing my reviews first. Our second outsider looking in at the human condition is Worf. For most of the season, Worf had very little to do and was given almost no characterization beyond being a Klingon, until Heart of Glory, which finally gave us a pretty solid vehicle for Worf, fleshing out his character by giving us some background on him and how he came to be in Starfleet, the internal conflict he's always facing between his heritage and his upbringing, as well as giving us the first real taste of expanding the culture of the Klingon race as a whole beyond the mustache-twirling villains of TOS. He continued though to be pretty much in the background doing very little even after the death of Yar as he takes over being head of security. It also establishes early on the trope of Worf getting his ass kicked or getting denied when making suggestions on what to do. Considering Worf becomes one of the most beloved characters, as well as Michael Dorn making the most number of on-screen appearances in all of Star Trek, his start was rather underwhelming. And as a result, I don't really have much to say about his character just yet. But don't worry, there's plenty of good stuff coming for him. Finally, Lieutenant Natasha Yar. By far the weakest character and actor in the main cast, I've already covered much of my thoughts about Yar in her swan song episode Skin of Evil, where she was unceremoniously killed off by an evil oil slick, but let me go over it again in brief here. She was completely underused and never given a chance to shine, mostly relegated to pushing buttons, pointing a phaser at someone, or opening hailing frequencies. She didn't even get one single story focused on her character, and no, Code of Honor doesn't count because that wasn't about her, she was just a pawn in someone else's game. Okay, Dr. Crusher didn't get a focused story either, but Crusher is given way more screen time than Yar and is often portrayed in a consistent manner, and thus given decent characterization. Denise Crosby obviously left the show towards the end of the season because she was unhappy with not being given anything to do and wanted to try and expand her career elsewhere with, unfortunately, poor results for her. Her acting left a lot to be desired, but I'd argue that much of season 1 had oft times wooden acting, and because she was never given the chance to get some meaty stories or grow as a character, was unable to grow as an actor either, and I always felt this was a shame. I mentioned in my review of Skin of Evil how I actually thought her sudden death was okay because it showed how dangerous life in Starfleet can be and how easily life can be snuffed out with no magical cure to bring her back to life. And this is before an era in TV where killing off your main characters became a thing. However, her death ultimately had no meaning as she was killed off by a cartoon villain oil slick in an offhand way, and because we never knew or cared about her character, her death didn't really have the emotional impact it should have. Don't worry though, Crosby does get to come back a few more times both as Yar and a future Romulan character. And now that I've covered the characters, let's take a look at my top 3 picks for the best episodes and top 3 worst episodes of the season. This was a tough call for me between this and Coming of Age for third position, and ultimately the Arsenal of Freedom won out for me simply because it's pretty much a full-on action episode on the ground and in space. It's got a good use of the saucer separation mechanic and a generally great ensemble effort by all our main cast members, with everyone getting something to do bar Wesley, who wasn't present. And by far the standout part is Geordi taking command of the ship and having to deal with the various challenges thrown at him, and most of the stuff on the surface is quite fun as well, as Riker and company try to keep up with the automated weapons that continually upgrade themselves. The only stumbling block is the scenes in a cave with an injured Crusher, and Picard trying to keep her stable and awake. The pacing just stops dead when this happens, but thankfully we only get a couple of scenes like this. Conspiracy could have been my top pick, but is undermined somewhat by uneven pacing and rushing to the end. Though the episode could have greatly benefited by being a two-parter as well as being the actual season finale, it still comes out as one of my favourites because it's just so damn fun. A great mystery, there's actual continuity as the events leading up to this are established in Coming of Age, cheesy but fun action, and one of Star Trek's most unexpectedly goriest moments with an exploding head and melting chest cavity. Perhaps the only season 1 episode that was solid from start to finish. 1100-1001, which is quite a mouthful to say, had a great and memorable alien species with the Binars, by far the best in all of Season 1 and one of the best in TNG overall in my opinion. There was good characterization of Riker, good use of the holodeck, great teamwork from Picard and Riker as they retake the ship, and it's just very well paced. A rare example of ideas coming together and being implemented well at all levels. Again, this was a tough call for third position here between this or Justice. However, Justice didn't quite make this because as bad as Justice is, there is something laughably bad about it instead of just being straight awful bad. Lonely Among Us is perhaps the most messy, what the fuck episode of Season 1 where the crew are completely stupid, don't recognise abnormal behaviour, and then goes completely off the rails towards the end as Picard is beamed out into space for over an hour, but is successfully beamed back just fine and dandy. Oh, and also the episode treats the brutal murder of a diplomatic envoy they're carrying on board as if it's just a light-hearted joke. Almost the inverse of Code of Honour, with a female-dominated society instead of a male one, this one didn't come off quite as racist, but still scored highly on coming off as sexist. Patriarchal or matriarchal societies can be interesting to examine if they're done right, but this episode is certainly not that, as the female leader swoons over the supermanly Riker while one of the other female leaders swoons over a MacGyver lookalike. It's another Prime Directive Dilemma episode that's just as bad as Code of Honour's dilemma, with a completely forced and stupid situation on the ship with a viral infection taking most of the crew down. Oh dear. Possibly ranking as one of the worst episodes of Star Trek ever across the entire franchise, sharing the honour with Spock's Brain in TOS, DS9's Move Along Home, Threshold in Voyager, and These Are the Voyages for Enterprise. This episode came off as quite racist, sexist, even if that wasn't the intention, and even most of the actors felt uncomfortable during the filming of this episode. It was our first Prime Directive Dilemma, and that too was terrible. Absolutely nothing redeeming about this one at all, so skip and avoid at all costs. There's not a huge amount of trivia to go through yet in the episodes, as we're still establishing our tropes and whatnot. There are no Picard manoeuvres, there's just one Riker manoeuvre, Worf gets denied a handful of times and his ass kicked 4 times, and the crew do love their meetings. I noted 17 separate meetings in the conference lounge where 3 or more people were involved. I think going forward I'll try to track more of the tropes we're used to for future trivia. Perhaps the thing I noticed the most was the constant reuse of the same studio set for doing anything off the ship. In all I noticed 15 separate appearances, some obvious, some subtle, but you can always tell because of that rocky background that's used. Here's a quick montage for you. Oh, and let's not forget that we had 4 separate chief engineers, while other episodes didn't even bother with having one at all. So there we have it. Was this the weakest and most uneven season of Star Trek in all of Star Trek? Well, I suppose that's debatable. First seasons of Star Trek shows are known for their rocky starts, and especially given recent times depending on how you feel about Discovery. But I certainly think so overall. And yet it lays the groundwork of a show that ultimately ends up being a fan favourite, and being the embodiment of what Star Trek should be all about at its core. I look forward to seeing how much better Season 2 is with my analysis mode on. Like all seasons it has its stinkers, but I don't recall Season 2 being anywhere near as bad as the first. We're also in for a number of changes. Most notably, Gase McFadden was fired and replaced by Diana Muldaur, who will play Dr. Catherine Pulaski. Apparently showrunner Maurice Hurley didn't like McFadden's acting and there were some issues on set with her, which I'll cover more in the future. Other changes include Geordi getting promoted to chief engineer and gets a gold uniform along with Worf. There are also some noticeable changes in the bridge set, particularly the seats at helm and ops, as well as some clear lighting differences. We also get a new regular set, 10 forward, and Whoopi Goldberg is added to the cast, introduced as the bartender Guinan, who runs 10 forward. And, most important of all, Riker grows his beard. So, I look forward to seeing you on my journey in my Season 2 recap and reviews. If you enjoyed this, please feel free to like, subscribe and share, and do check out my Season 1 episode reviews if you're a new viewer. Also, once again, I strongly urge you to check out the Chaos on the Bridge documentary to get a better insight about TNG's creation and beginnings, because it's just so eye-opening and fascinating. Until next time, this is Jay Warden, signing off.